Now, Mearsheimer, I actually think he's a realist, but he also thinks China is the threat. He actually
Yeah,
thought about that, but he's
yeah,
more realistic about that. He did
yes.
say that we should not provoke Taiwan, but put more resource to focus on how to deal with China. Now,
Mm,
I think he also talked about that probably on the Duran with your guys or maybe somewhere else. He has said that before the election, it's good. It would be good for the Biden administration to not stir up anything in
mm,
Taiwan, to keep it as it is.
mm.
But it doesn't seem like, I mean, with that kind
Yeah.
of a speech, that doesn't seem like the thinking of the Biden administration. I mean, why
Mm,
would they want to, this new leader in Taiwan to have that kind of a speech if they
yeah.
really want to keep the status quo at least
Mm,
until the November, right?
mm.
So what do you think?
Right, let me just quickly talk about Professor Mearsheimer, who I know. I mean, I've done many programs with him. I mean, I've never met him person to person, but I think I understand his mind. I mean, he is deeply patriotic American. He is
Mhm.
somebody who's very keen on America preserving its national interests, defending its national interests, and he sees China as a rival. I mean, he's no makes no secret about that. He sees China as a rival. He does see China, I think, as a potential threat. This, however, and I've spoken to him in person about this, comes alongside a very, very great respect and in some ways an admiration for China, which I've experienced myself. So he wants rivalry with China, competition with China. He wants a very hard, tough American policy towards China, but he absolutely does not want war. He wants a rivalry, in other words, with China, which I would describe as a rather softer version of the rivalry which existed between the United States and the Soviet Union in the Cold War. In other words, a situation where the two countries are neither friends nor enemies exactly, but they're adversaries, not quite as bad as it was during the Cold War with China, but they're adversaries. Um, they maneuver constantly against each other, but they do so in a type of equilibrium in which each side respects the core interests of the other. And on that, of course, he recognizes that China has a particular interest in Taiwan. Now, you may agree with that policy or you might not. I personally think that this is unnecessary. I don't think there's any reason to get into that kind of relationship with China either. I think, on the contrary, there is no reason why China and the United States should not be friends. Just saying. That's my own personal view. But, I can understand that from a person who believes in great power politics and great power competition, as Professor Mearsheimer does. And I do find that outlook both historically based and rational from a Western point of view. He is speaking from within the Western tradition of statecraft. The Chinese tradition, which is to look for consensus, is different. Now, the thing to understand about the Biden administration is that it is not rational in that way, and I think that is where I think he gets it wrong. I mean, I don't blame him because I have repeatedly got this wrong myself. I've said in the past also that it didn't make any sense that the United States should want to get into a conflict with Russia over Ukraine. That's what I believed. I said many times that it makes no sense for the United States to get into a conflict with China over Taiwan. I've said at various times, not so much in this election, but this election cycle, but in other election cycles, that the very last thing you want to do in an election in the United States is draw the United States into a great power war. That makes no sense to me whatsoever. The thing I have repeatedly discovered is that the people who hold power in Washington, and especially those who are powerful within this administration, think in a completely different way.
Mhm.
Now, winning the election is obviously for them important, but defeating China is more important still. It is, in fact, their fundamental and overriding obsession and concern. And what I suspect is happening is that the signals from Donald Trump and his team are, to put it mildly, very mixed. And that's being optimistic about it. They're probably saying to themselves, well, we got a president who is extremely hardline on everything and who wants to confront China in every way he can, and who is as rude about Xi Jinping at every single opportunity. So he might not be president for very much longer. So let's move this agenda along forward as fast as we possibly can before he goes, so that if the next president, who may be Donald Trump, decides to change the policy towards China, he finds that he cannot do so. So I think this is what is actually happening.
They want to they want to set the course already, get this started already. Yeah.
Yes.
And whoever is the next president, including Biden himself, right?
Yeah.
He won't be able to do anything afterwards.
That's right.
Now, the war and the election I find interesting. I'm not so sure. If you look at the past history, like Bush, W. Bush, he was doing poorly, you know, in the war in Iraq, but he was still reelected. And Obama, he openly said he wanted to be a war president, and he did. He opened a new front. Okay, he opened a new war, even though he was given the Nobel Peace Prize, and he was reelected. And even Nixon, now Nixon's Watergate was after he was reelected, even though the Vietnam War was going poorly, but he was also reelected. So I just wonder, you know, it seems like the electorate, you know, the people who are voting, they seems reluctant in the middle of a war to change. They call them, you know, the president is the commander in chief. Is there some elements of that? Do you think?
Undoubtedly, there is. In fact, there's even a film that came out in the United States about 20 years ago. You probably remember it, called Wag the Dog, which is on precisely this issue that, you know, a president in trouble, how does he get himself out of trouble? By inventing a war somewhere. And in that case, it was a purely imaginary war. But of course, you can't really create imaginary wars. You have to create real ones. I think there's a strong element of this, that, you know, you create a situation in the United States of war psychosis. And of course, it's useful in so many ways. Firstly, you can say that your opponent is unpatriotic and is on the side of the enemy if he criticizes you. And you can also use the war in order to enhance your power as president and that of the executive in all sorts of ways. You can lean on social media to restrict the views of your opponents and your critics. You can get your friends in the media more easily to block off what they're going to say. You can control the discussions and you control the debate, and it can work to your advantage. And it did that for Nixon, and it did that for Obama, as you said, and for George W. Bush, and it could very well do that for Biden too. If Biden loses the election, it's not going to be because of the wars or because of his foreign policy. It's because of the economic conditions that most Americans find themselves in. There is an element within US society which is opposed to these wars and which is tired of them and wants them to end. And it is getting bigger, but it is very, very far from being a critical mass at the moment.
Yeah, and going back to the Ukraine war here, we just talked about it, right? There's all kinds of provocations. This, it's always sometimes I feel like the smaller countries like Estonia, the Prime Minister of Estonia, Kaja Kallas, right? She's the one who's calling on collective response, which is to me means NATO should get in. And the Duda, the Polish president, wants the nuclear. He called it, you know, nukes in Poland to deter Russia. I mean, how can that deter Russia? And then Blinken and Stoltenberg both said that, you know, there should be a strike inside Russia using NATO weapons. And their argument is, okay, once those weapons given to Ukraine, those are Ukraine weapons. You can feel free to do whatever you want.
Mm.
So all these, to me, are very dangerous thing. And the Russian did responded with all this, with conducted a tactical nuclear weapon drill. What every time I notice, every time when I thought the war is ending, something happens, whether there's new injection of cash or new, more advanced weapons or very provocative talking, etc. So there's powerful forces do not want this war to end. Is that right?
Absolutely, they want to escalate it. And yesterday, over the course of a press conference, um, President Putin of Russia, gave the strongest warning he has ever given to the West. He actually spoke about unending escalation. And that's what he said. I mean, he used those very words. He said that what we're getting from the West is unending escalation. And he said, do these people understand how dangerous this is? And he said, if they go on with this course, well, we're not just going to sit back if they start launching missiles at us. And he went and discussed the various technical features of each of the missiles that have been talked about, the British missiles and the French missiles and the American missiles. And he said, this claim that these are going to be Ukrainian weapons makes absolutely no sense, because the way in which these missiles operate, they can only operate if they are provided with the guidance and the technical support of these Western countries, Britain, France, and of the United States. And he said that Russia will not sit back and let it happen. It cannot allow that situation to arise. It will have to respond. He didn't say exactly how, but he gave a very clear warning. He said that countries in Europe need to understand how dangerous the situation is. Some of the smaller ones need to understand that they have dense populations. And, what he was basically saying is that if there's missile strikes, or indeed, God help us, nuclear strikes, I mean, they will not survive, because there is no reason for them to do so. And he actually said something really quite extraordinary. He said, if Europe finds itself in this situation, in that kind of conflict with Russia, then the United States will be left with a very difficult choice. Does it intervene in this conflict, given that Russia possesses nuclear strategic parity? So, I mean, the warning he's given could not be clearer. And he even said at one point, do they want the conflict to go global? And, we come back to this threat that he made, not threat, I think, warning that he made about a couple of weeks ago, in which the Russians warned the British that if the British missiles are launched against Russia, the Russians will feel free to retaliate against British military facilities anywhere in the world. And of course, we know that American military facilities are present in a great many places around the world, not just in the continental United States. So Putin gave this very, very clear warning. And is it the big headline story in the media in the West? Are people being informed about it? Do you read the New York Times with editorials and op-eds about this? Do the BBC and CBS and all of these places feature it? There's been complete silence. It's as if Putin is talking to himself. Of course, he's not talking to himself. He is the leader of a nuclear power, a major nuclear power. And he's given, I think, the most stark warning I've ever seen a political leader do ever since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. But there we are. I mean, it's incredible to me that this isn't talked about or discussed in the way it should be.
Yeah, that's the strange thing about our media, right? When there is some serious things that they need to talk about, they don't. They talking very hawkish, they use all kinds of threatened language towards Russia, demeaning language, et cetera, to provoke Russia. They are fine with saying all those kind of things. You know, calling Xi Jinping is calling Putin, calling everybody dictators and those kind of things. They're totally okay. But now there's a real real sign of things can go bad, very really go really bad. They don't talk about it, right? They don't.
No,
They pretend it never
no,
happened. They don't
no.
say anything. It's so strange. I find that the media, on the one hand, they seems to like to see conflict, but then when there is a real possibility of a real bad conflict, then they don't talk about it. It's
Well,
so bizarre
it,
to me.
it is utterly bizarre, but there is an explanation for it, which is, of course, that if the American people and the people of Germany, France, and Britain were informed about the risks their leaders are taking, then they probably would react. I mean, I'm sure most people do not want to be in a situation when missiles and potentially nuclear bombs and nuclear missiles are flying from one end of the world to the other, and we are in a World War III situation. The only way the Western leaders can continue with these policies is by concealing what they are doing from their own people. And if you want to understand whether there is democracy in the West or not, then that tells you more clearly than anything else that on this fundamental issue, there is none.
Yeah, yeah, that's also how I feel. Yeah, there's going to be this peace conference that's been talked about in Switzerland. Is that next month, I believe?
Yeah.
So the Ukrainians made a big deal out of it. They are inviting 160 countries. Now 90 of them already declined, including China. And even, I mean, they didn't invite Russia, which totally meaningless to me. Okay, you're talking about a conflict, but one side you're not inviting. And Russia said they're not going to sending anyone, okay, involved whatsoever. And China kind of like softly declined it. In my view, they said that they haven't worked out any details. For now, they don't have anybody or something like that. Was very mild, I think, decline. Even Biden said he's not coming.
Yeah.
So what they are trying to achieve? What's the goal here? Is it just optics, totally optics?
Well, it's actually very. I'm glad you've asked this question because it's very difficult to understand what the objective of this conference was. Now, back in August of last year, at the height of Ukraine's offensive, the United States basically sponsored a meeting which actually took place in Saudi Arabia, which seems to have been, the sort of seed for this particular conference. And in fact, there was a whole series of meetings in which Western governments, plus Ukraine, plus certain countries in the global south, including China, India, Saudi Arabia, and Brazil, got together, and the Americans tried to push all of these countries to accept a peace proposal, as it's represented to be, by President Zelensky. Now, President Zelensky's peace proposal is it's completely unrealistic. It wants Russia to withdraw completely from Ukraine, accept Ukrainian sovereignty, agree to pay Ukraine reparations, agreed to the arrest and prosecution of its leaders for war crimes. And then once all that's done, there will be some kind of negotiations between between Ukraine and Russia about, well, I'm not quite sure what exactly. But I mean, I'm only very slightly, I'm only making this look slightly more absurd than it really is. It is that kind of proposal. But that was this proposal that, they were going to discuss in August last year. Because in August last year, the expectations were that Ukraine was going to succeed in its counteroffensive and would win the war. So there was a kind of diplomatic sense there, because you'd say if Ukraine achieves a military victory, then you can bring all these countries together, you can put this proposal, we can get those countries to agree to it because Ukraine looks like it's going to win the war, and then it can be presented as a united global response to the Russians, and that will be a kind of ultimatum to them from the entire world community to capitulate and to come to terms with Ukraine. That was the plan then. But of course, things have turned out completely otherwise. So why have they persisted with this process and gone ahead with this conference in Switzerland, to which the heads of state and heads of government are invited? And I have real difficulty understanding why. I don't think many people do. And I think what basically happened was that the Ukrainians got very, very committed to this. They thought that this would be the way to try to win, in some diplomatic way, what they've basically lost on the battlefronts. And somebody came up with the idea that the people to organize this conference would be the Swiss, because Switzerland is supposed to be this neutral country, and the Russians would be invited, but they wouldn't actually be invited. They'd be told to come along and hang around in Geneva in various hotels. And then when the conferences ended, they'd be, asked to come and join when they'd be presented with the finished document, which would be the consensus of every of all the countries that participated. And of course, the Russians said, "No way, we're not involved. We're not going to send anybody. This is nothing. This makes absolutely no sense to us." And Switzerland is not behaving like a neutral country. And from the moment that happened, it's difficult to understand why they continued with this conference at all. And more countries, as you rightly say, are staying away. Important leaders are staying away. President Biden, who I think senses that this is turning into a debacle, has decided to stay away. And I think the only reason why this is continuing at all is because the Ukrainians themselves got incredibly committed to it. There's a story circulating, and I want to stress it's a story. I don't know how true it is, but the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov mentioned it and seemed to say that it probably was true, that he'd been heard that it was true, that there was a meeting in April between Zelensky and Western diplomats, in which the Western diplomats appear to have tried to tell Zelensky, look, this conference in Switzerland is falling apart. You must make some concessions to the Russians if you're going to try and persuade anybody to come, or perhaps we should call off this conference entirely. And apparently he went into a massive tantrum. Lavrov said it was an astonishing display, but that's Lavrov, but it seems plausible enough. And anyway, he refused and insisted that the conference go ahead. And presumably that's why it's going ahead. And now he's very upset and very angry because Biden isn't going.
I mean, as it looks now, it's going to be very disappointing, right? I don't think it will generate anything. And then after that is the NATO will have a meeting in Washington, I believe, follow this peace conference, which I'm sure will be another disappointment for Ukraine, because they want to join NATO. I don't think they will be allowed to join NATO in that meeting either. Don't you think that they won't be in Washington?
Well, the United States and Germany have publicly said that Ukraine is not going to join NATO at this meeting. And in fact, the German Chancellor Scholz, has come forward and said that he's not sure when Ukraine will join NATO. And he sort of seemed to suggest it might even take 30 years before it does. It's very crushing for Ukraine. But I mean, at least that spells out the reality. I think these constant attempts to talk Ukraine into having these hopes is very cruel. My friend Brian Beletic says that what the West is doing basically is holding out various hopes to Ukraine about missile attacks on Russia, European troops to Ukraine, diplomatic initiatives that will go nowhere, basically in order to keep Ukraine fighting, at least until the November elections. And I think he's probably at some level right. And of course, all that's doing is that more Ukrainians are dying every single day. More damage is being done. I read an absolutely horrifying article in The Guardian, in which I discovered something I didn't know, that half the population of Ukraine is now suffering from PTSD. Half. And, the cruelty of this is just beyond expression. But apparently it goes on, and it will go on at least until November and perhaps even beyond.
That's pure evil, because of election in the US, they keep on letting the Ukrainian die, knowing full well they're not going to let Ukraine into NATO, but they
Yeah.
dangling this thing right in front
Dangling,
of
exactly.
Yeah.
I have to say, I mean, all the things that we were discussing before, war with China, war with Russia, I mean, it's mad. Though all those things are mad and evil as well. But this is not quite so mad, but it is extremely evil as well. It is very wicked. What they're doing is heartless and incredibly cruel. If they're not going to intervene to help Ukraine, then they should simply say so. If they can't help Ukraine to win, they should tell Ukraine to negotiate. And if they're not prepared to have Ukraine in NATO, then they should tell Ukraine that. I mean, there's no point in prolonging this agony in the way that they're doing, in the way that causing the results that they're causing. And if it's as cynical as Brian Beletic thinks, then all I can say is, I mean, this is one of the worst things I've ever encountered, one of the darkest moments I've ever known.
Not only they don't, they dangle the thing like trying to let the Ukraine continue to fight. If anybody say anything, right, you should convince them to negotiate, then you will be characterized as a Russia puppet, right?
Yeah.
So they even dismiss the people who are actually wanted to end this conflict, which ultimately is the good thing for Ukraine if you can end this conflict quickly.
Yeah.
But yeah, they discredit those people.
Well, absolutely. I mean, and I've been called that myself. I mean, there've been petitions to get me thrown off YouTube because I've been calling them these. I mean, every one of us who says these things gets called that. And by the way, just for you to know, I recently been called a puppet of C as well, Chairman C. He was the person referred to him as, which I find really quite funny, actually.
Yeah, in the Chinese media also, if you are sympathize with, if you want to end the war in Ukraine, they would characterize you as the puppet, Russian puppet, and they will always say, okay, glory goes, Ukraine has the glory. What does that even mean?
Well, it doesn't.
Ukraine can have all the glory it wants, but in the meantime, they're losing territory, they're losing people.
Yeah.
So what does that even mean? Glory goes to Ukraine, right?
Well, it's. I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's a Ukrainian, a fascist Ukrainian slogan, by the way, which dates from the Second World War. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. It was part of the, made famous by the fascist movement. But no one needs a country of dead heroes. That's what you would get. I mean, it's not really heroism. It's the kind of heroism that the SS in Germany had. Even as they were, being annihilated and were annihilating others. It's pure nihilism of the most, as I said, terrible sort. As a Greek, I mean, the word hero is a Greek one. I could say absolutely, this is not what heroism. It does not correspond with the Greek conception of the word hero in any way, which is, by the way, from what I read of Chinese literature, not so different than the Chinese conception of what true courage and heroism also is, which always has a very strong moral component to it as well.
Yeah. Yeah, being a hero actually doesn't mean you just keep on fighting. That doesn't mean that. It means when it's time for you to, for example, apologize, you have the courage to apologize, to admit mistakes, right?
Absolutely.
And I mean that lots of time that's the hardest thing to admit that you're wrong. Okay, that this war is wrong. I mean, could have been
Absolutely.
avoided.
Correct. That's entirely right. But that requires moral courage, which, as I said, in China, absolutely, if you know anything at all about Chinese history, I'm not just talking about Chinese literature now, but Chinese history, it is an absolutely fundamental quality that is profoundly there in Chinese culture. Going all the way back, to the time of the Warring States and the philosophers of that time. Moral courage, the ability to face reality, to speak truth, to tell people who are more powerful than yourself what is the truth, and to make just and humane decisions based upon it. That is the real quality of the hero, not the kamikaze warrior, which is what the Japanese were doing during the Second World War, which is another example of the false heroism that we're talking about, the corrupt heroism that we're talking about.
In Chinese history, it's interesting. One of the emperor 2,000 years ago during the Han Dynasty, Han Wudi, he is very famous for fighting the more territories and then defending the border. I mean, he's very famous for being a real warrior. Okay, during his time, but he also famously he made mistakes toward the end of at the later his life, and he actually wrote an apology. Imagine that, an emperor. He wrote an apology. He listed all the mistakes he made to spread it to the whole country. He apologized to the people. He said, I made these mistakes. Those are my mistakes, and I apologize for that. I find that's pretty stunning. Imagine any leaders today doing that. I find that's pretty extraordinary.
Absolutely. I mean, that kind of humility and self-awareness and humanity and compassion does not exist, and sense of responsibility, by the way, as well. That does not exist in the West today. And when we talk about responsibility, responsibility is a key aspect, or it's supposed to be a key aspect of democracy. So the fact that there's no sense of it today, again, calls into question how far the West can be described as democratic anymore. It looks like Han Di was a more democratic emperor than any of the leaders of the West are now.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, I also want to ask you.
Wudi. I think you call him
Han Wudi,
Wudi.
yeah, Wudi,
Yeah,
yes, Han
Wudi.
Wudi, yeah. He's very famous, yeah.
Yeah.